Chapter 9. London. Chrisid Bank was steeped in historical myth and legend. Centuries old and still independent, it stood on the corner of Pall Mall, on the original dirt road, which was cobbled when the horse and cart had dominated the highways. Beneath modern pavement level, its Corinthian column entrance led up to its highly polished door. It had profited under the steady hand and guidance of its previous exalted chairman into the richest bank in the world. For over 150 years, not a single coin of the realm had passed its redundant counters that remained perfectly polished, their filigree ironwork and embossed leather countertops displaying the bank's heraldry. None of its hand-picked clients were ever permitted to visit. Business was based on every raw material of worth. Mr. Stenmore, its current chairman, was as much of the bank as it was of him. Steadfast, unutterably loyal, rich, and with a honed intellect to turn cartwheels around the financial markets. He'd steered Chrisid, trumping algorithmic trading strategies with his predictive method of social anthropological analysis. He presented an enigma by his astute business acumen in market prediction. He'd never read anything other than the financial reports of the bank and had an aversion to computers. His PA, Miss Stone, who worked tirelessly on his behalf, admired and respected him. However, recently, although she couldn't put her finger on it, something was amiss. There was nothing in his manner or outward appearance to even remotely suggest anything was different, but she knew it was. Mr. Stenmore was concerned, which was a very rare thing. His anxious brow had been scanning the archived bank ledgers, and he now leaned back with a grim look of foreboding, his suspicions now confirmed. It had taken him precisely 1 week of intensive study to know for certain. On this one occasion, he'd wanted to be wrong. The financial anomalies he'd begun to trace across decades led him back through past eras of the bank's historical ledgers. What he'd found was a pattern matching global economic changes, and none of them pretty. Famine, war, ethically questionable scientific milestones. Each global disaster coincided with a surge of funds being funneled through supposedly reputable organizations. As he tracked the distribution of money, where it had been used to buy and sell natural resources on an unprecedented scale, he'd matched it to political shifts resulting in the control and manipulation of the world's population. Western avarice was being financially fattened, effectively making them their own jailers and compelling them to run faster and harder on their treadmills. This was matched by a marked decrease in the mortality of the most destitute in the world. The systematic weakness of humans for possessions was being expertly exploited. Mr. Stenmore's specific interest fell into one area: genetic research. A single catalytic event in his recent past had caused him to examine who and what he really was. When the name of the Titans had been used in conjunction to transactions that he could base in fact, the first of the dominoes had fallen. What he'd originally believed to have been benevolent financial gestures had now taken on a sinister connotation. Miss Pilgrim had been one such recipient. She'd been funded using various methods to disguise its origins. He'd been a blind fool. But he couldn't blame himself entirely, as it had been suggested he was a product of their design and making. His initial reaction had been to scoff at such a preposterous idea. Despite his initial dismissal and then reticence, his analytical logic had forced him to finally conclude the suggestion was feasible. After he'd been instructed to use Chrisid's financial clout to freeze Pilgrim's assets, it had added credence to the existence and proliferation of the Titans. That event had made him draw a line. On one side, the Titans, on the other, himself. On that occasion, he'd ensured Pilgrim remained solvent. It had been sufficient that the Titans were trying to control and sublimate her purpose. Since that time, his attention had been turned to his own predicament. He quickly unravelled how much and for how long money had been funneled into various genetic research projects. All of them had financial links to a facility in Stade. Although modern maps showed that supposedly the institution was no longer there, large sums of money continued to pool to its location. He tracked the money through various financial tributaries, which had also led to his discovery of an orphanage. His research had revealed a high-security compound with an enviable academic faculty, solely funded by the facility in Stade. His belief in his own existence as a unique and normal human being had fractured. He'd discovered financial messages within acrostic numeracy. He'd been impressed. All the strings of this abominable financial marionette were held by Chrisid, and he'd been instrumental in increasing its net worth. He realized his considerable success had only been achieved due to his remarkable numerical ability. Specifically, he was exceptionally brilliant in one particular aspect: patterns within numbers. He briefly considered that unquantifiable element, luck, which might account for his success. However, other people had worked as hard and for longer than him. They'd also maximised their opportunities. The conclusive distillation which explained the divide between him and his nearest peer group was down to his feature analysis, his ability to extrapolate future snapshots of fiscal behaviour. Even selective human acquisition couldn't account for the Titans' unparalleled financial weight. Given evidence of their involvement in human genetics, it could only logically equate to one inescapable conclusion. They were creating people to meet specific needs within their organisation. His shock and dismay at this revelation was tempered by his logic. He'd questioned whether or not his reaction was normal. He'd reminded himself, given the evidence of his belief, it was a question he was not equipped to answer. Instead, he'd posed himself two seemingly insurmountable problems. The first was what action should he take, knowing his bank had been founded and was operated by the Titans. Secondly, but more disturbing, he was now cognizant of the fact he was manufactured. He used the intercom. "Miss Stone," he summoned. In the outer office, Miss Stone took a deep breath. There was no intonation in his voice that belied an unforeseen problem. Just the fact she was being called at 9:45 in the morning meant something was out of balance. Rising, she headed with her pad and pencil to his office. She entered with curiosity rather than trepidation. "Mr. Stenmore? I will be out for the remainder of the day. You can reach me at my club in the case of anything unforeseen." "Yes, Mr. Stenmore." He rose, walking past her into the outer office. Taking his coat, hat and gloves, he proceeded directly out the door. Miss Stone returned to her desk. Unforeseen? The fact he'd never used such a word during her years at the bank prompted her to press the intercom button for all. in the habit of using weather analogies to inform the other few members of staff when something was amiss, she warned, "The barometer shows a storm brewing." As heads rose around the bank, a palpable sense of foreboding ran through them. Having traversed Chrysid's long marble corridor that ran from under Pall Mall Street to its reception house on the opposite side of the road, Mr. Stenmore ascended, exiting through the security gate. Standing on the pavement, he looked up at a grey, forbidding sky, so apt for the task ahead. He wasn't going to his club, although that had been his initial intention. No, this called for action, something he was unaccustomed to. Nothing too energetic, however. He shouldn't do anything rash. He needed time to think. He'd been right in the first instance. He should go to his club. The fact he'd hesitated emphasized to him the gravity of his situation. The Daikino Club remained the last male bastion of refuge in London. Now privately owned by its members, it stood for everything that was impenetrable and stalwart to its patrons. Systemically traditional, it also laid claim to being the irregular financial and political backbone of the city. Founded in 1643 by Sir Francis Staife, head of the Privy Council, and chief commerçant and designer for a then young London town. Sir Staife, favourite of Queen Elizabeth I, had immortalised his financial opportunities. A flattering life-size marble statue of Elizabeth I in royal regalia stood within a concave backdrop of gold leaf. It had caused a scandal in its day by its blatant flattery, but Sir Staife had shrewdly ensured the club's longevity. As he'd predicted, Elizabeth I had revelled in the homage paid to her. Over the centuries, no one had dared to either deface or modify in any way the original construction of Daikino, and every member was required to doff his hat to Her Majesty before entering. Mr. Stenmore climbed Daikino's well-worn stone steps to its front door before quickly doffing his Homburg and passing through. Once inside, the smell of beeswax, expensive cigars, and the unmistakable aroma of fine brandy slowly melted away his angst. His tread became lighter, his brow smoothed, and his breathing deepened. He was met at reception by a bellboy who efficiently divested him of his coat, hat and gloves and dissolved behind the long reception desk. The grand foyer of Daikino had been built specifically to impress. A wide oak-panelled hallway led to a grand central staircase, which split left and right to form a large gallery, set back against a 2-story high stained glass window of 16th century London. Above was written in gold the Latin, "In te habitant fecundium," "In thee we trust." To either side of the staircase, on the ground level, lay vast reception rooms. The floors were laid with oak, now carpeted 2 feet from the walls, edged and framed with highly polished brass strips. Oil paintings of enormous proportions lined the upper wall space above, documenting its previously esteemed members. Mr. Stenmore walked into a galleried reception room to his left. Leather high-backed chairs littered its interior. This room was a place to ponder, surmise, reflect, and plot. He chose an isolated chair in the further reaches and sat quietly, putting his hand up to halt the approaching waiter. He didn't want any distraction, as he considered very carefully his next course of action. His face was drawn and grave from the complexity of the onerous task ahead. What did he want to accomplish? He mustered his thoughts dispassionately. He would force the Titans to realize their underlying fault, which in turn he calculated would unravel the fabric of their society. To achieve this end, he would undo what they'd done to him. With sadness he acknowledged he was their creation, not born from love, as he'd once been led to believe by Nanny, but out of avarice for a single purpose, to serve their ends. Are we not all serving in one capacity or another, and predominantly for the dreams of others? Yes, but my choice to serve was clinically removed under an electron microscope. I'm a modern-day slave, albeit one that lives a life of luxury and privilege. Not even a pampered pet. They're loved and treated with affection. I'm a mere cog. He summoned the waiter, who hurried over. A large black Remy. Immediately, Mr. Stenmore. In contemplation, he acknowledged his task seemed an impossible one. To add to or change one's genetic code, is it possible? If not, can I live with myself, knowing that every action I take is programmed and anticipated? There had to be a solution. He felt an overwhelming need for justice. Maybe the Titans could be brought down from the inside. He needed an ally, but not just any ally. It wasn't just the Titans' influence, as pervasive as it was. It would need a denial that could not be meted out by a terrestrial being. His thoughts turned to Pilgrim. He surmised she was an error, an anachronism, and yet the Titans wanted her. Why? She was beyond their control, therefore not of their making. From what little information he had so far, she warranted much closer scrutiny. He instantly felt an affinity to her precarious predicament. She vexed them, and he'd witnessed their reaction. This truth would commence the beginning of his plan. My plan, not to be shared with anyone but myself. But can I trust myself? Do I know myself completely? Maybe not. For the first time, his conviction in his ability to think freely wavered. He took a deep breath. Which question should I be posing to myself? Am I capable of personal truth? What am I? Human, surely. I exhibit all the traits, but can I be certain I possess free will? He questioned his natural penchant for automatons. No, he mustn't lie to himself. It was an obsession. He verified this fact by speculating how he'd react if he no longer had access to them. The thought of a life without his automatons caused a shudder to run through his sombre mood, making him anxious. He tried to imagine any other thing which could provide him the solace, joy, and absorption given to him by his mechanical friends. Nothing immediately sprang to mind, until he imagined his sorry self muttering in a vacant room, cutting out paper figures. He reminded himself everyone had some obsession, but it wasn't everyone who would lose their sanity if they were deprived of it. He felt the weight of the complicated task he'd set himself. He concluded, I'm an automaton. Granted, a very sophisticated one, but an automaton just the same. Now he knew what he was up against. He was up against himself. Could he outsmart himself? Could he grow beyond the genes that had been selected for him? He leaned back in his chair and continued his contemplation. Can a person be more than their genetic print? Can they correct those primal strands through will? This puzzle suited his analytical mind, which immediately raced forward until he reminded himself to guard against such charms. If the only tool to achieve such an end is a person's will, but a person's will is exhaustive. If one were to constantly have to will oneself to perform against a certain predisposition, then it merely becomes a habit. No, he decided. Habits can be broken. There must be a way to rework oneself on an atomic level. As improbable as his whole discourse sounded, he seriously entertained the idea. There are those one hears of that accomplish tremendous feats, which come from highly unlikely beginnings, but that's mostly derived from fear and self-preservation. He thought he remembered being fearful somewhere in his childhood, or perhaps it was just his imagination. As far as self-preservation was concerned, he couldn't be sure, as an occasion to prompt such a state of mental anguish had never happened to him. Plus, he reminded himself, these feelings could be fleeting, and he knew his psyche would be unable to evoke a genuine, sustained response. He wiped off his mental blackboard and started again. First, he should establish if there was any evidence to prove a person could improve their genetic code. Who to ask without the Titans finding out? Why, of course, the very fellow. He smiled.